are the undefeated champs looking to defend their crown here in 2019. Mark Rogers, TV, the voice of college football, breaking down Clemson with Pigskin and Pete. How you doing this afternoon, man?
Hey, listen, I'm amazing and fantastic, but you already know that.
I kind of guessed that. But it's just a courtesy to ask. But you are flying high, and why not with this football team and the program running on all cylinders as it is? I opened up my laptop today, looked just to make sure I didn't miss any Clemson football news, did a Google search and see that you're entertaining another 5-star on campus. So that's just the way things are rolling right now at 15-0, defending national champs, and you just don't win the national championship game. You completely embarrass the team that everybody thought was the best. That feel has to, you got to maybe pinch yourself every once in a while just to think, hey, I know we won a national title a couple of years ago, so I know we're capable, but to do what we did, I still kind of am not understanding how we pulled that off.
Yeah, so I've been pinching myself since about 2012. So that'll never stop happening as long as Clemson's, doing what they're doing. I don't, a lot of fans start to take stuff for granted. I don't, because I know that this could end at any day. I mean, nothing is given every single year. Nothing's in stone as far as how long will we have Sweeney. I tend to think we'll have Sweeney for a very long time, but you just never know. So that 2 years from now, I could be sitting around and moaning about another 6-6 season like we used to have. So, but the recruiting has been going well. 2019, I call Clemson 4-star university because we seem to pick up every 4-star in the country, but we hit on all the 5-stars we get. Now, the 2020 class that's coming in is projected to be probably the best recruiting class that Clemson has had under Sweeney and maybe ever. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, who knows what you can get accomplished if you get a little talent in there.
Yeah, we're lacking talent.
All right, we got Pigskin Pete on the line to talk some Clemson football. The boys are in camp. Not a whole lot of news. Everything chugging along as expected. Let's look at the offense. It's pretty well in line, in set. I know you lose one of your leaders up front in Mitch Hyatt, one of the very best at what he did, and we'll talk about him in just a few minutes regarding the NFL draft. But otherwise, and then there's that guy that would catch a few clutch passes here and there, I think, Mr. Hunter Renfrow. But besides that, talent all over the place and experienced big game talent.
Yeah, so this offense is going to be absolutely loaded. I actually did a video the other day where I project that Clemson has the potential to be the best offense in the country this year. And that's not just me being a Clemson homer. That's just if you look at the personnel across the board. I mean, the wide receivers position is got to be the deepest in the country, and that even eclipses teams like Oklahoma and Ohio State, which always have deep wide receiving cores, in my opinion. The offensive line is something that a lot of non-Clemson fans have been pointing out. Well, you're losing, Mitch Hyatt. Well, we got Jackson Carman. I know you know who he is. He's an Ohio boy that we stole out of Ohio. Oh, yeah. He'll be taking Mitch Hyatt's place. And the rest of the offensive line, this might be the most veteran offensive line we've had in a while. I think there's 4 seniors and then Jackson Carman. So I'm not too worried about the offensive line. Obviously, our running back core the past couple of years has been, as deep as we've ever seen it before. A lot of people like to point out, back when Spiller and Davis were the 2 running backs at Clemson, that might have been the best Clemson running back duo, which I agree. But we have 3 and 4 elite running backs at this point, so we don't have to run Travis Etienne, to death, and he's got fresh legs late in the year. So from the wide receiver position to the quarterback position, obviously, to the running back position, we are just absolutely loaded, and I'm not really too worried about the offensive line.
And that running back depth is something that we've only really seen, and I know somebody might write in and find a team in 2011 or some aberration of an example out there somewhere that we've only seen out of Alabama. So you mentioned the other elite teams like in Ohio State, like in Oklahoma, and some of the other teams that have been at that level, Georgia, in the last couple of years. Yeah, they've had the 2 guys, and Georgia's right there as well. They do have 3 and 4 at this point. But to have that wave of running backs where the 4th guy is going to get drafted is pretty remarkable and keeps the guys fresh and throws a lot of different concerns at the defense in regards to skill set. You got this guy who's the bulldozer. You got this guy that can go out in the flat, catch a ball, or go downfield as almost like a slot receiver. You got this guy that's the burner, or they're really all burners, but they all have different skill sets. And, it looks like you've gotten to that point where you just have that stable of running backs and everybody's fresh and everybody's ready to go.
Yeah, that really helps, especially in an offense like Clemson's where they, you can't be one-dimensional. You can't be pass-heavy, and you can't be run-heavy. Well, you can be run-heavy depending on who you're playing if you're just trying to control the clock and beat them into submission. But to have these two capable running backs behind Etienne, because Etienne is still going to be the featured back. But last year, Etienne, if you look at his numbers, I think he had like 1,600 yards, 20-something touchdowns, but he averaged over 8 yards a carry. Well, not just last year, even his freshman year, he averaged over that. And so he's only taking like 12 or 13 carries a game. When you look at like other schools like Jonathan Taylor and even Bryce Love, these guys are carrying the ball 25 times a game, and he's putting up stats that are similar to theirs as far as yardage. Now, I know they got more yards, but he's just killing everybody in yards per carry category.
Yeah, I've seen some numbers thrown around in regards to his numbers and yards per carry being historic. Some of the best numbers in college football, as you mentioned, the 2 years running now at right around 8+ yards per carry.
Right.
Pigskin, I'm going to let you maybe dissect this down to a T, because I can't come up with any issues with Trevor Lawrence. It's like, Michelangelo or the Mona Lisa or something like that. Is there any way in which he would need to or could improve this season?
I think I know it's hard it's really, you're nitpicking at this point because he can make every throw on the field. He's a lot more mobile than people give him credit for as well. And he's quick. And I think he's tough. Even the game where he got knocked in the head and got knocked out of the game by Syracuse, he was begging to come back in the game. So the guy's a gamer. Arm talent is out of this world. So if I had to nitpick, I would say that going into his second season, he will be a lot better at the line of scrimmage as far as reading defenses and possibly changing plays. And again, that's the sort of thing that you get better with time and experience. And not that he was bad at it last year, but I think that there's a big difference between a true freshman who's trying to sort of learn the ropes and a guy that's accomplished what he's accomplished in his first year and coming back after another full off season now of watching film and learning this sort of thing. And I think next year he'll be just a more heady player instead of just relying on his talent alone.
Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, breaking down Clemson. We got Pigskin and Peete on the line. Clemson at spring practice right now. Nothing substantial to talk about there. Just reviewing personnel and looking forward to the NFL draft. All right, Pigskin, let's talk about this defense. I think you're probably happy to move along those scrubs you had along the defensive line, get them finally out of the program
right.
and off to the NFL, if they could possibly maybe make a roster or a practice squad there. But my goodness, that would rate as one of the great, not just defensive lines in the history of college football, but one of the great units in college football. It still sticks with me in looking at a Sports Illustrated rundown of what they consider to be the top 100 players in college football last year going into the season. And again, I'm not latched onto Sports Illustrated being the end-all, be-all in regards to rankings and ratings, but this was pretty much consensus where they had, I believe, 3 of those guys rated in the top 11 players. So
right.
You're not just talking about having 3 players on your team in the top 11 in the country, but 3 at the same position. And then Austin Bryant was like at 17 or 22 or somewhere like that.
Right.
It was just ridiculous, the wealth of riches, but you got to replace a ton of those guys.
Yeah. So here's the good thing about having depth. And I'm not dismissing the fact that we're losing, some world-class players, all 4 stars off the defensive line. But there are a crop of really good guys that are already there that were playing behind them, and the only reason they weren't starters is because they were playing behind them. So I think that what you're going to see is you're not going to see a huge drop-off as far as talent goes on the defensive line. You will see a definite drop-off in depth. So that could, depending, God forbid there's some sort of injury during the year to one of these key players. I still think that our depth is good, but not near as good as it was last year. I mean, we were just rotating guys like nobody's business last year, and you saw a lot of the younger guys, which was good, got a lot of playing time last year. But the names to look for this year on the defensive line, KJ Henry, he was redshirted, 5-star player who would have started for anybody in the country except for the depth that we had. Xavier Thomas, I believe, is going to be a household name. This guy is a freak of an athlete. Anybody who doesn't know who this guy is, you'll know who he is very soon. And just go look at the plays he did play last year. He has size, speed. He's going to be a top NFL prospect when he comes out. So he'll be a true sophomore. And, of course, I think we still have Niles Pinckney in there, to clog up the middle. Big guy. And he's got a lot of experience. So I'm not too worried about the overall talent. And I think with our schedule this year, and I know a lot of people love to point out Clemson's schedule, and that's fine, that we shouldn't have a problem outside of 1 or 2 games with these guys getting a lot of pressure and getting a lot of experience. So by the time we get to the ACC championship or into the playoffs, hopefully that they'll be a lot more experienced.
Got Pigskin Pete on the line talking some Clemson football at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, where our aim is to provide the best in discussion, debate, and analysis on the game we love, college football, each and every day, even here in March. So let's look at the rest of the personnel on defense. Trey Lamar moves on. He declared early. If there was any kind of concern, Pigskin, as you well know, going into the college football playoffs, it was okay if a quarterback like an Ian Book or a Tua especially gets the time to throw. Are they going to be able to pick apart this defense? It didn't happen aside from some shots in the first quarter against Alabama. But the secondary, your thoughts about maybe what was, again, with the standard being extremely high, maybe a weak link on the team last year.
Yeah, so that has been the weakest link on our defense for several years now. When you look across the landscape of college football, I think that's a weak link on most teams because it's an extremely difficult position in college football with these air raid systems, and they just aren't quite physically mature or mentally mature enough to handle that sort of thing. In their first couple of seasons, you see the most dominant players in that position, happen in their junior, senior season, and of course teams like Florida and LSU, they and even Georgia, they rack up on these defensive backs every year. So we, like you mentioned, we lose Trey Lamar at linebacker. We lose Trayvon Mullen, who was probably our best cornerback last year. I do think that we recruited very well in 2019, but again, those guys are going to be freshmen. I think you're going to see some moving around of players that may shock some people. So Darian Kendrick, who was a true freshman receiver for us last year, and he actually was a high school quarterback. So this guy's gone from quarterback to receiver, and there's talk that he may be playing full-time or at least a lot of the time at cornerback this year. So he's been doing that at camp this year so far, and they're saying he's looking really good. On top of that, we have Isaiah Simmons decided to come back. Thank God. He's one of our better cornerbacks. And then Tanner Muse at safety is a big unknown. Tanner Muse is a veteran player. This guy, he has a very unique skill set. So he's a great tackler. They move him to linebacker a lot. He's almost doubled in size, not literally, but the guy has put on so much muscle and weight since he's been at Clemson that he's almost too big to be a safety now. He's more like the size of a linebacker, but he's not familiar with that position. Whenever they do put up linebacker, he does struggle a little bit. So he's the unknown. I don't know if they're going to move him or not. That's going to be something that's interesting to see.
Talking Clemson football, Pigskin Pete's on the line for us, breaking it down as we look at the offense and the defense. And before we talk about the guys that are moving on to the next level, you did mention the schedule. And there's nothing Clemson can do about the schedule. They scheduled one difficult opponent outside the conference in addition to the South Carolina game. So in regards to, there's not a whole lot of schools out there scheduling mid-tier to upper-tier 2 SEC teams. So you can't help what's going on in the ACC, which I thought was very weak last year. But that kind of rests on Florida State and Miami to get their acts together because they're the two that really need to build the conference. The others are pretty much doing what you would expect, and Syracuse jumped out as being better than they typically are, and North Carolina is kind of weighing down at the other end, and they've got the potential to be much better. So when we look at the schedule, it's almost front-loaded, and when I say that, I don't mean like murderer's row, but when you look at Syracuse being the number 2 seed from last year, and if they turn out to be the second-best team in the conference again this year, they're in week 3 after the big game against Texas A&M. This time you get them at home. and that's after Georgia Tech, who's obviously going to give you a different look than they typically do with Paul Johnson out of the way. So your thoughts about the schedule, and of course, I think Florida State's the wild card, because who knows what they have the ceiling to improve by leaps and bounds and not necessarily challenge you, but on a given day, they've got the roster to put a scare into you and start beating these other teams.
So I completely agree with you. I've been on record as saying that I think if Clemson gets past, I think they'll get past Georgia Tech week 1 for obvious reasons. And I do think Georgia Tech's going to get better under their new coach and their new scheme and getting rid of that triple option, Monty thing they've been doing with Paul Johnson. But week 2 against A&M, luckily that's in Clemson. And I actually believe, and I could be wrong. A lot can happen between now and then. I'm a big believer in Texas A&M and Jimbo Fisher. I think that they are on the rise, and they will be a top 5 or 6 team here in the next couple of years, and they're going to be a problem for anybody in the country, not to mention the SEC West division that they're in. But if we get past Texas A&M, and then we go on the road the very next week to play Syracuse, if we come out 3-0 after the Tech game, A&M, and then Syracuse, I just would be very shocked to see anybody else on our schedule challenge us for the rest of the year. Maybe South Carolina, but again, I still think that South Carolina is on a different tier than Clemson. So, North Carolina State, they're just not. I know they give us trouble every once in a while, but they are on sort of a downslide right now. Louisville is an absolute mess. They need 3 or 4 years to get their stuff together with their new coach. So, yeah, I agree with you. If we get out of the first 3 games 3-0, then I can't see where we're going to lose a game, quite honestly.
Louisville turned from 7-8 win team, 9-win team every year to a disaster last year. And now Ken Satterfield comes in to clean it up, and that probably will take a while. But it's a really good division now that Wake is actually a legitimate team that goes to bowl games, wins bowl games the last 3 years. Syracuse has obviously improved remarkably. Steve Addazio brings pretty much the same program and team every year. They just play good defense, run the ball, and go 7-5. And that's what they do, and probably win 3 or 4 in the ACC. And again, I think the entire conference and some credibility there in making it a race hinges on Florida State. And then secondarily on Miami in the other division, because we saw what we got last year in, people, there were, comments made on my channel and discussions about, who can challenge Clemson and does so-and-so, are they a legitimate challenger to the ACC championship? And I pointed Pitt last year, and I say, raise them as, would you consider them to have been a serious challenger for the ACC championship? And nobody thinks so, but they were in the game. So they were 60 minutes away, but the team lost 7 games. So the other division is just awful at this point if Miami doesn't get things cleaned up. But obviously from a talent standpoint, recruiting, resources, and brand, it's Florida State number 1 and Miami number 2 to try to even things out and make this interesting at some point again. Yeah,
and I would honestly throw, listen, Miami last year had a lot of high expectations because of the season they had before that. Coming into last year, they sort of underwhelmed everybody, including me. But Virginia Tech really needs to finally do something. Justin Fuente, I'm a big fan of his. I thought he was a good hire when they hired him. Mm-hmm. And Virginia Tech is not the sort of team. They're like the Steelers in NFL. They don't fire coaches. So they've only had 3 coaches in the past 50 years or something like that. So when Justin Fuentes came in there, I was high on him for about 3 years. Before last year, I said, listen, he's got to do something this year or I'm going to jump off the bandwagon with him. And, they were terrible last year. Had some inexplicable losses to some really bad teams. They had a couple of good games, but, just really were not a challenge to anybody, even bad teams. And so if Miami and Virginia Tech can at least get back to being somewhat good, I'm not even asking them to be a 12-win team or 11-win team or a New Year's Six team, but listen, you got to do better than what you're doing. If they can get back to somewhat of a relevancy, then that'll help the conference out a whole lot. And you mentioned Florida State. Florida State is such an unknown at this point because I don't think that Willie Taggart is a bad coach, and I think it's too early to really say that. But if you look at his track record, the guy's rebuilt a couple of programs and made them relevant.
Yep.
I think he's a great recruiter, and I think probably even X's and O's wise, he's really good. But if you look at just the mental mistakes and the problems they had all throughout the games last year, I mean, they were constantly getting penalties for stupid things that were coaching related problems, not player related. They were always having 12 men on the field and having false starts and just stupid penalties, and that's coaching. That's not players. So if he can get the coaching staff, and when I'm talking about the coaching staff, I'm talking about his assistants and everybody to buy in, because Florida State has the talent. There's no doubt they are definitely, like you said, probably the second most talented team in the ACC, right there with Clemson. And so they have no business going 5-7. And the reason I think they're so confusing is because if you told me right now, if we were looking through a crystal ball and you said next year Florida State's going to be 5-7 again, I wouldn't be shocked. If you also told me that Florida State's going to be 10-2 or 9-3, I wouldn't be shocked about that. It all hinges on what they get fixed and what they don't get fixed. And so that's a team that the ACC needs to be good, number one. And number two, I think it's a team that has the ability to be good if they can just get their problems together.
All right, Pete, we got to disagree on something here.
Okay.
But I'm in the same category with this stuff. Justin Fuente, I made the same comment a number of times, and the most recent one was last week when asked about Justin Fuente. I said the same thing. I thought that was a great hire. He did the job at Memphis. He comes in, as you well know, gave you guys a very competitive ACC championship game, like a 45-37 game, won the division,
right,
and looked like he was going to have a strong run at Virginia Tech, and they were awful last year. They were okay the year before. Lost to Old Dominion by 2 touchdowns.
Yeah.
When you talk about Florida State, exactly. You give me any team in the conference, and I think I can come within 2 games of predicting their record without much thought about it. Florida State, yeah, I would probably throw 7-5 on them just because it feels like they're going to be there. They have to be better to some degree, and they just have too much talent to lose that many games. But until they show that they're not going to screw up football games in the last 5 or 10 minutes, or just be completely unprepared like they were for many of their games last year. Really, they only played 2 decent games. They beat Wake Forest by 3 touchdowns, and they squeaked one by BC at home by 1 point. They beat 2 decent teams, and everybody else, they just looked unprepared every week. They just outclassed by teams that had less talent. So it's intriguing to me to see if Willie Taggart can get the teams act together. And he's an offensive guru, and their offense was completely out of sync the entire schedule.
Yeah, and if you don't get that offensive line fixed, you're not doing anything. And that extends back before Taggart got there. The last couple of seasons that Jimbo was there, the offensive line was terrible. But I agree with you. I just, there's no excuse for what, I mean, especially being the schedule they have outside of Clemson. Now, I know they play Miami. That's a tough game for them, I guess. But outside of those 2 teams, there's really nobody on their schedule that they should be losing to. And to get embarrassed the way they got embarrassed last year, I mean, I don't know if it's going to take 3 or 4 years for the players to buy in. And a lot of those players were Jimbo's players, let's be honest. So they might not have bought into his whole philosophy, and they might not have wanted him there. And that, if you don't have everybody on board, then things can go south in a hurry. But I'm not sure that the Florida State fans or the boosters will allow 3 or 4 years of that to go on before they can wait for a turnaround.
No doubt. Pigskin Pete on the line, talking Clemson football and the ACC. Let's talk about these guys leaving, heading on to the next level. There's a whole bunch of them. 3 guys declared early. You can just kind of pick them off as you'd like in regards to who you think could be a star at the next level, impact player, just your thoughts about who transitions well.
Yeah, so obviously I think Dexter Lawrence and Christian Wilkins are the 2 biggest stars on the defense that I think are going to be drafted in probably both in the first round. Definitely, I think maybe both in the top 20 for sure. And I think that they will, they are NFL players last year, so I think they'll fit in wherever they go as far as the defensive line goes. Austin Bryant, I think, is a good player, and if he goes to the right situation and I think he'll be successful too. But he's not a first round guy. I don't think. I think he's probably going to go somewhere in the early or mid second round. Trayvon Mullen is an interesting prospect at cornerback. I think he was rated to be the third or fourth best cornerback in this draft, which was actually kind of shocking because you look at the talent that's coming out. Listen, this NFL draft this year is so heavy on defense. It might be a historic defense draft. We might not see a running back in the first round at all for the first time in I don't know how long. I don't know. I tend to think you won't see a running back go in the first round. But the cornerbacks and the defensive linemen in this draft are just ridiculous. I think Hunter Renfrow is probably the biggest sort of diamond in the rough. And obviously I'm biased on that, but I think that the way the NFL is changing, these slot receivers that have very good hands and can run routes well and that are smart, you're seeing this as a premium position now all over the NFL. And there's a lot of jokes that he'll end up at New England because they like their white slot receivers. And, you know, I listen, that might be true, but I think there's a lot of teams, Houston, Oakland, San Francisco. Now, what round he'll go in is a complete unknown. He could fall as low as the 6th round, and I wouldn't be shocked if he went as high as the 3rd round. So everyone's really keeping an eye on him because I think he's a game changer. I think he'll be a good pro, but he's certainly not a first round talent. But I think that if he gets picked up in the later rounds, he'll be a steal for whoever gets him. Kendall Joseph at linebacker, maybe a mid round pick. I don't know. He's an unknown too. Listen, he's a great player at Clemson. I'm not sure that with all the great linebacker talent in this draft and just in the NFL in general, unless he really outperforms what we think he can do, I don't know how he'll translate. Mark Fields is another defensive backer I think is very good. He's probably a mid-round pick.
Yeah, the guy that comes to mind when you run them all down in terms of who was the most fun for me to watch, and I'm going to put Hunter Renfrow in a different category, was Austin Bryant, because I love those guys that I can just single out as, wow, okay, it's 3rd and 8. They're coming off the edge. Here they come. Let's see if they get to the quarterback because they just make disruptive plays. They're just freakish athletes. They get the size, the speed, the long arms, and just seeing them line up against the left or right tackle and do their thing, I think is a whole lot of fun. So I loved watching Austin Bryant. And then Hunter Renfrow, as you mentioned, if you graded him, if you had every NFL team grade him and where they would select him, his average might be very low, fairly low, but all it takes is one team to love that guy, and I think that's where the thought process on him is sporadic, and so there's probably a handful of teams at least that might be really high on him, and it just takes the right fit or the right perceived fit for one team to jump out and say, hey, yeah, this guy is a player, forget the measurables at the NFL Combine, grab it.
Yeah, and if you look at his numbers as far as catches and touchdowns, if you look at it over his career, aren't overwhelming or anything. But if you look at his catchable ball percentage, he led the past 2 years. In 2017, he had 0 dropped passes that were catchable, which I think is the only guy in the country that did that. Last year, he had 1 drop that was catchable. So that is an astronomical number. And if you look at, I think his speed is underrated. I think his route running is underrated. I think he's extremely smart and clutch. So all those things translate to the NFL well. Like you said, I think it just depends on the team he goes to, and the quarterback he's got throwing him the football also really plays a big part in it.
I saw a graphic while watching the NFL draft at Combine this past season where they showed the top receivers in the NFL, the A.J. Greens and the Antonio Browns,
right,
and Julio Jones, and all those guys who had the most yardage and catches over the last 5 or 6 years. And you think of those guys as being freakish athletes, and they are, but they showed their 40 times against the best 40 times for the wide receivers that ran this year and the best players, the defensive backs thrown in, and they weren't impressive. They were in the 4.5 and 4.6 range. So I know that the NFL puts a premium on speed, and football fans do, but they're not running in a straight line most of the time, and then they throw pads on them, and it's just, yes, it means something, but the absolute burners aren't necessarily the best players. Dante Pettis came out of Washington a couple of years ago. He made no, I'm thinking of John Ross.
Yeah, John Ross. Yeah.
Washington. Yeah, Dante Pettis was the other
John
guy
Ross ran a 4.2.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and no, he's not going to be a very good receiver in the NFL, I don't think.
Right.
He hasn't shown it to date.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more about that. Well, this is a whole other video. We can go on this for an hour, but I think that size, and when I mean size, I don't mean their weight or their muscular build or anything. I mean how tall they are. Like Kyler Murray, I think that height and speed are important, but they're vastly, vastly overrated in the way that the NFL game is played today.
Absolutely. Talking Clemson football, the NFL draft, and the ACC with Pixie and Peete. I encourage everyone out there to look him up here on YouTube. Just search Pigskin Pete. You'll find him talking Clemson football and lock it in right there. All right, we appreciate you stopping by, man. It's been a great conversation.
Hey, listen, with all this March Madness stuff going on, it's good to get on the phone with somebody who still wants to talk about college football because everyone else seems to forgot about it.
Oh, we're locked in on college football all the time.
I hear you, man. But thanks for having me. It's been great. Thank you.
All right, man. Next time, I want you to bring a little bit more energy, a little more passion, maybe be a little more optimistic about the day.
Well, I can't promise anything.
Oh, hopefully we'll catch you on a better day.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, man. We appreciate it.
All right, man.
Have a good one.
All right, have a good one. There you have it, folks. Mark Rogers TV. I'm sure most of you guys already know who he is. That was for his channel. I'm just going to upload it on my channel as well because I figured why not. And so I'm sure you guys already know who he is. He's probably one of the hardest working and nicest guys on YouTube as far as college football goes. And so if you don't know who he is, go over there, check him out. Hit that big red button, hit that thumbs up, and tell him I sent you too. And I look forward to getting up with him. I don't know. I guess I didn't bring enough energy for the guy this time. But anyway. Thanks, Mark, for having me on. Thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Have a great day. Pigskin Pete checking out.